What the Study Says.
Welcome back to What the Study Says. I'm Dr. Kai.
And I'm Dr. May.
For the last few years, maybe the most frustrating thing we've heard about, medically speaking, is this feeling, almost like sticky molasses where your thoughts used to be.
Yeah, exactly. Not just being tired, but really struggling to concentrate or remember things, or even just figure out simple steps.
And for way too long, this brain fog was kind of dismissed, wasn't it? Maybe just stress or lingering depression.
But today, we're moving past just the self-reports. This deep dive is all about finding the objective physiological proof for these persistent cognitive issues after a SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Right. We've pulled together a lot of material, everything from huge U.S. population surveys to really tightly controlled human challenge trials, plus some pretty sophisticated brain imaging analyses.
So our mission today is to sift through all this data and answer, is this post-COVID brain fog actually a quantifiable medical reality?
And what specific brain functions are really affected, like demonstrably?
And importantly, what does the evidence suggest might be happening physically? What's the signature left in the brain, if any?
Okay, but before we dive in, maybe we should quickly clarify the terms the research uses. It can get a bit confusing.
Good idea. So if you have symptoms, cognitive or otherwise, that last between 4 and 12 weeks after getting COVID, that's clinically termed ongoing symptomatic COVID-19.
Right, 4 to 12 weeks.
But once those symptoms stick around for longer than 12 weeks, that's when it crosses into post-COVID-19 syndrome. And that's what most people mean when they talk about long COVID.
Got it. Okay, so let's tackle the biggest hurdle. First, proving causality. For a long time, studies linking COVID and brain fog were tricky to interpret.
Absolutely. It was the classic confounding problem. You compare a group who had COVID to one that didn't. Well, how do you know any cognitive differences weren't already there?
Yeah, maybe due to pre-existing conditions or socioeconomic factors or just, different baseline cognitive abilities before they even got sick.
Exactly. Which is why this prospective human challenge study was such a game changer. It provides that controlled proof we needed.
Tell us about that one. It sounds intense.
It involved 34 young, healthy volunteers who had never had COVID. They were seronegative. And the key thing, they were prospectively inoculated with the original wild-type SARS-CoV-2 virus.
Wow. So deliberately infected in a controlled setting.
Yes, and then monitored incredibly closely for a whole year, up to 360 days.
That really is the gold standard for getting rid of those confounding variables, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know exactly what their cognitive function was like before infection because you measured it yourself.
Precisely. You have that crucial pre-infection baseline.
So what did they find? Did it confirm the link?
Unequivocally. The trial showed a significant difference in what's called the baseline corrected global cognitive composite score between the group that got infected and the uninfected controls, even a year later.
Okay, baseline corrected global cognitive composite score. That's a mouthful. Let's break that down a bit. What's that score actually measuring?
It's essentially a summary number. It rolls up how people performed across a whole battery of cognitive tests, memory recall, attention speed, processing accuracy, you name it.
And the baseline corrected part is key, I assume?
Absolutely critical. It means they weren't just comparing people against each other, they were measuring the change in cognitive function within each person, directly resulting from the infection itself.
So it isolates the impact of the virus.
Exactly. It proves the cognitive impairment is a direct, persistent consequence of getting SARS-CoV-2. No more ambiguity about whether it was caused by the virus or something else.
Okay, so even in young, healthy people, there's a persistent change. But what about the broader population, especially those who got much sicker?
Right, that's the next step. We need to look at the larger studies, the longitudinal cohort data. One key study looked at 351 people who were hospitalized with COVID and compared them to almost 3,000 matched controls over a year.
And what did that show about the type of impairment? Early on, some thought it might just affect executive functions like planning, right?
That was an early idea, the dysexecutive syndrome hypothesis. But this larger, more robust data found the deficits were actually global.
Global.
Meaning it affected pretty much all the cognitive areas they tested: speed, attention, memory, executive function. It wasn't just limited to one specific domain.
And this is where the severity comparison comes in, the one that really grabs your attention.
Yes, the aha moment, as you called it. The study compared the magnitude of the cognitive loss they measured in the post-COVID group to the decline seen in normal aging.
And the result was startling, wasn't it?
It really was. The level of cognitive deficit they observed was functionally equivalent to the cognitive decline that normally happens between the ages of 50 and 70 years.
Wait, let me just process that. Equivalent to 20 years of normal cognitive aging, delivered in just months.
That's what the data suggests. It puts that feeling of brain fog into a completely different, frankly, terrifying context. It's not just a minor inconvenience.
It really isn't. It's like a sudden, accelerated aging of cognitive function. Did these hospitalized patients show any signs of getting better over that year?
There was some positive news initially. Right after the post-acute phase, there was a noticeable trend towards recovery. People did improve.
Okay, that's good.
But that improvement often plateaued. By the time they did the follow-up assessments, maybe 6 months later, the rate of improvement had slowed right down or stopped for many.
So the initial bounce back didn't always continue.
No. Many were left with persistent, measurable deficits even a year after their infection.
Looking at those who were hospitalized, were there specific things during their illness that predicted who would have the worst cognitive outcomes later on?
Yes, definitely. The severity of the initial illness was a big factor. Specifically, having a history of encephalopathy or delirium while they were acutely ill was a major red flag for long-term cognitive problems.
Encephalopathy.
Yeah.
We hear that term quite a bit. Can you clarify for our listeners what that actually means in this context? What's happening in the brain during that acute phase?
Sure. Encephalopathy basically just means brain dysfunction. During a severe infection like COVID-19, it shows up as things like severe confusion, delirium, maybe a decreased level of consciousness.
So it's a sign the brain is really struggling during the acute infection.
Exactly. And its presence suggests that the initial hit, whether from the virus directly or the body's immune response, was strong enough to significantly disrupt brain function right then and there. That seems to predispose people to lasting issues.
Okay. And beyond the purely physical severity, did mental health scores also play a role?
They did. The studies found that post-acute psychiatric symptoms were highly correlated with the cognitive complaints people reported.
Meaning things like depression and anxiety.
Precisely. High scores on standard questionnaires for depression, like the PHQ-9, and for anxiety, like the GAD-7, were significantly linked to worse cognitive outcomes.
So PHQ-9 for depression severity, GAD-7 for generalized anxiety. These are common tools doctors use.
That's right. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean depression caused the cognitive loss or vice versa, but they definitely travel together in many cases. It highlights a complex interplay.
A really important connection to understand for recovery. Okay, let's zoom out again. We've talked about hospitalized patients, but what about people managing long COVID in the community? How common are these daily cognitive struggles?
The large U.S. survey data gives us a good picture here. They looked at nearly 15,000 people. Among those who identified as having the post-COVID-19 condition, well, the numbers are quite striking.
How striking.
56.7% reported experiencing at least one cognitive symptom every single day.
Over half. Wow. And how does that compare to people who felt they fully recovered from COVID?
Big difference. Among the fully recovered group, it was 27.1%. Still not zero, interestingly, but less than half the rate seen in the long COVID group.
So when people say brain fog, what are the specific daily issues driving that number? What are they actually experiencing?
The most common complaint, reported daily by 38.1% of the long COVID group, was trouble concentrating.
Focus issues. Makes sense.
Yeah. Followed closely by slowed thinking and difficulty multitasking. Even things like struggling with decision-making were reported daily by over a quarter of them.
These aren't trivial things. They impact daily life profoundly, which brings us to the big so what? Does this widespread cognitive impairment translate directly into real-world problems with functioning?
Unquestionably. The data showed a very strong link. Reporting daily cognitive symptoms was strongly associated with also reporting at least moderate interference with everyday functioning.
Okay, so it impacts daily tasks, relationships, managing life.
And crucially, it impacts work. The study found a statistically significant lesser likelihood of maintaining full-time employment among those with daily cognitive symptoms.
That's a huge functional and economic cost. Now, you mentioned something important earlier, that researchers controlled for depression when looking at the employment data. Why is that significant?
It's really significant because it helps answer a key question. Is this cognitive impairment just a manifestation of depression or severe fatigue, something that looks like cognitive failure but isn't primary?
Right. Could it just be that people feel too down or exhausted to think clearly or hold a job?
Exactly. But because they statistically adjusted for high scores on depression and anxiety scales and still found that the cognitive symptoms were significantly linked to employment loss.
It suggests the cognitive deficit is its own problem.
Yes, it points to the cognitive impairment being a primary clinical feature. It's a distinct, measurable issue, not just a side effect of feeling unwell or depressed, although those often coexist.
That validation is so important for patients. It confirms this is a biological thing impacting their lives and careers. So let's get into that biology. If the virus isn't usually found rampaging through the brain itself, what's the physical evidence? What's the biological signature?
Well, we can actually find objective signs of injury in the bloodstream. Serum analysis from hospitalized patients detected elevated markers of brain injury.
Markers like
Things like neurofilament light or NFL and glial fibrillary acidic protein, which is GFAP.
Okay, NFL and GFP, those sound pretty technical. What are they actually telling us is happening?
They're basically structural proteins. NFL is part of the internal skeleton of neurons, those long nerve fibers. GFA is found in astrocytes, which are crucial support cells in the brain.
So building blocks of brain cells.
Right. And when you find higher levels of these proteins floating around in the blood, it's a signal. It means there's been some kind of neural stress or damaged neurons, or their support cells are distressed or breaking down.
Like finding debris after an accident.
That's a good analogy. It's molecular evidence of physical damage or stress within the central nervous system. And interestingly, higher GFAP levels were specifically associated with cognitive deficits in the COVID group.
So the blood tests show molecular signs of trouble. Did they see corresponding changes when they looked directly at the brain using imaging?
Yes, they did. High-resolution MRI scans done about a year after hospitalization showed definite structural differences. Specifically, they observed reduced gray matter volume in the post-COVID patients.
Reduced volume, meaning shrinkage.
Essentially, yes. Less volume in the gray matter, which contains most of the brain's neuronal cell bodies.
Was it general shrinkage or in specific areas linked to cognition?
They found one area where the link was particularly strong. Reduced volume in the bilateral anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, showed a significant correlation with the overall cognitive deficits across the groups they looked at.
The bilateral anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, what does that part of the brain do? Why would shrinking there lead to brain fog symptoms?
The ACC is a really critical hub. It's involved in integrating information for complex tasks. Think conflict monitoring, regulating emotions, attention, and especially making effortful decisions. It helps you filter things out and focus.
So if that region is physically smaller, less robust.
It provides a very plausible physiological explanation for the exact symptoms people report. Difficulty concentrating, trouble managing multiple things at once, that feeling of decision fatigue. It all fits.
It maps directly onto the lived experience of brain fog. And tying this all together, the injury markers, the volume loss, the leading theory on how this happens remains immune-mediated, right? Not direct viral invasion.
That's still the prevailing hypothesis supported by the bulk of the research, yes. The idea is that it's para- and post-infectious phenomena. Meaning it's likely the body's response to the virus, a prolonged or dysregulated or overly aggressive immune reaction that's actually causing the damage to the nervous system, rather than the virus itself setting up shop in the brain tissue long-term. There's just not strong evidence for widespread viral persistence in the brain.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the core objective truths we pulled from these studies for everyone listening.
All right. First, post-COVID brain fog isn't just subjective. It's an objective, measurable, and persistent cognitive deficit. That's confirmed even in those rigorous human challenge trials.
Point 1, it's real and measurable.
Second, the severity is clinically significant. That comparison to potentially 2 decades of normal cognitive aging really underscores its impact.
Point 2, it can be seriously debilitating.
And third, it's linked to actual physiological changes in the body and brain. We see measurable brain injury markers like NFL and GFP in the blood, and we see structural changes like reduced volume in key areas like the anterior cingulate cortex on MRI scans.
Point 3, there's physical evidence.
Exactly.
This evidence is just crucial. It's the validation millions of people have needed, proving that these cognitive issues demand serious clinical attention as part of assessing long COVID. Especially, as you said, given the clear impact on daily life and employment.
And if we think bigger picture for a moment, what's really interesting is that this kind of neurological impact, it's probably not unique to SARS-CoV-2.
Oh.
We've seen similar findings, cognitive problems, even structural brain changes after other severe systemic infections, things like HIV, or even just following prolonged critical illness requiring ICU stays.
So this research has broader implications beyond COVID.
Absolutely. It obviously helps us understand and hopefully treat COVID survivors better, but the insights could be transferable. It might help us understand a whole range of post-viral syndromes or post-critical care issues much better.
Which leads to a really provocative final thought, doesn't it?
It does. If a systemic infection, one that might not even directly invade the brain in large amounts, can trigger this level of lasting, measurable brain injury through immune responses, what does that tell us?
What can these findings teach us about maybe being more proactive in protecting cognitive health during any severe infectious disease or a major inflammatory event in the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we shield the brain better during these critical periods? Lots to think about there.
Definitely food for thought. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on What the Study Says.
If you found this helpful, please subscribe and share the channel with others who might benefit. We'll see you next time.